Alvin Plantinga is, in my judgment, the most influential Christian philosopher of the past 200 years. He's worked in many different areas of philosophy, including philosophy of religion most famously, but others as well, and has left a lasting impression on each of them. He's established a research program that, since his retirement, has been carried on by many other scholars, just furthering his impression on those various fields. The name Plantinga is Dutch, and it's important to Plantinga, it can be seen in his work, that he's an heir to the Dutch tradition. He's a member of the Christian Reformed Church, which is an offshoot of the Dutch Reformed Church, and he studied at the college of the Dutch Reformed Church, which is called Calvin College, soon to be renamed Calvin University. In fact, he later went back and taught there as well. After attending Calvin College as a student, he went on to get his doctorate at the University of Yale in 1958, and after that he taught at Wayne State University before moving back in 1963 to Calvin College to be professor there. Plantinga's first book was called God and Other Minds, and in this book he tries to set out the thesis that belief in God can be justified in the same way as belief in other minds can be, rationally justified, that is. The subtitle of the book is in fact a study of the rational justification of belief in God, and this interest is going to recur as we look through the following corpus of Plantinga's work. Now, in this book, Plantinga begins by discussing negatively three famous arguments for the existence of God, saying none of them is successful. But he then goes straight on to repay the favour for arguments against the existence of God. He discusses four of those: the problem of evil, the paradox of omnipotence, an ontological disproof, and the verificationist argument. And he argues that none of those succeeds either. He came back to the problem of evil in particular many times later, but I'd just like to focus just for a moment now on the verificationist argument. At the time that he was writing, many philosophers were under the spell of something called logical positivism. That's the view coming from people in Britain like A.J. Ayer, but before him from people on the continent called the Vienna Circle, formed the Vienna Circle. And the view is that a sentence or statement is meaningful if and only if it is either a definition stating how the word is used, or it's something that can be confirmed by our sense experiences. And philosophers thought before Plantinga wrote that this was a problem for belief in God. Why? Well, because the sentence God exists isn't a definitional statement, but also it's not something, so they said, that we can confirm by observation. Now, what Plantinga does in this book, God and Other Minds, is he really takes that assertion apart. He shows that this principle of verification, as it's called, itself is neither a definition of how the word is already used, and if it's a proposal of how it should be used, then, well, the Christian or believer in God is free to reject it. And also, it's not something that can be confirmed by sense experience, by the evidence of our five senses. It doesn't work like that at all. And therefore, by its own merits, the verification principle is not even false, but meaningless. And this rebuff to logical positivism encouraged many Christian philosophers to be a bit bolder in standing out for their faith in the secular academy. In the last part of this book, God and Other Minds, Plantinga, as I mentioned, goes back to this core thesis that belief in God is in the same rational boat as belief in other minds. The point is this: just as one can't prove in a kind of mathematical style of proof that other people have minds, but it's obviously rational to believe that other people have minds. Indeed, we might think that it's actually irrational not to believe that other people have minds, to think I'm the only being with a mind in this world. That would seem on the face of it to be what was irrational. But given that we can't prove these things, Plantinga's point is that it doesn't show that it's irrational, the fact that it can't be proven. And by the same token, the fact that we can't prove the existence of God even by these venerable proofs, supposed proofs that Plantinga has discussed in the first part of the book, that fact that we can't, those proofs don't work in the sense of prove it in a mathematical way, that doesn't show that belief in God is irrational, just as belief in other minds isn't irrational. In fact, Plantinga tells a couple of funny stories to illustrate this point about other minds. He talks about the view called solipsism, which is this view I've been saying is irrational, to think that you are the only person with a mind in the whole world. The first story is a famous one that actually happened to Bertrand Russell. And Bertrand Russell received a letter from another philosopher called Christine Ladd Franklin. In fact, she was a logician as well as a philosopher. And she said in this letter to Bertrand Russell, "Dear Professor Russell, the arguments for solipsism are so convincing that I'm surprised there aren't more of us." And Russell said about this letter, since she was a logician, her surprise surprised me. The second story is Plantinga himself had a colleague from the medical faculty when he was teaching somewhere, and this colleague was supposed to be a solipsist, believed that he was the only person in the world. And his graduate students used to say to Plantinga, "You know, we take very good care of that professor because when he goes, we all go." In 1974, Plantinga published 2 more books along slightly similar themes. A popular one called God, Freedom and Evil, and a more academic one called The Nature of Necessity. And in these he develops in rigorous fashion, using tools of modal logic, something for which he's become famous, both the free will defense to the problem of evil and the ontological argument. I'll tell you a bit more about the ontological argument. For Plantinga, it starts with the idea that it's possible that there should exist a perfect being. But a perfect being is a being that would exist of necessity, would have to exist. It couldn't be that a perfect being just happened to exist. Now, in modal logic, if a being exists of necessity, we say it exists in every possible world. And if a being exists possibly, we say the being exists in some possible world, maybe more than one. So the point is this: if it's possible that a perfect being exists, then a perfect being exists in some possible world. But if the perfect being exists necessarily, then in some possible world, there exists a being that exists necessarily, that is, in every possible world. So in some possible world, a being exists in every possible world. But, and here's the crucial move, by a principle of modal logic, it follows that if something exists in some possible world in every possible world, then it exists in every possible world. And if it exists in every possible world, it exists in our own world, the actual world. So a perfect being exists in reality. Now, Plantinga doesn't actually think that this argument is 100% certain proof. Why not? Well, he thinks the atheist could deny the starting point, the first premise, which said that it's possible that a perfect being exists. He thinks the atheist could say, well, I just think it's impossible that a perfect being exists. But here's the point. Plantinga thinks that it's certainly rational, even if it can't be proven, certainly rational to believe that it's possible that God exists. But in that case, his argument has got you. If you think it's rational to believe that it's possible that God exists, then if the argument goes through, it must be rational to believe that God actually exists as well. The other argument that Plantinga discusses in this book, Nature of Necessity, and also in God, Freedom and Evil, is, as I said, the problem of evil. The problem of evil is that there appears to be a contradiction. This is the version called the logical problem of evil. A contradiction between 2 simple statements. God exists on the one hand, and evil exists on the other hand. Where's the contradiction thought to be? Well, the idea is that God is, by definition, all-knowing, all-loving, and all-powerful. And so, given that he wants to remove any evil, he knows that there is evil, he knows how to remove evil, and he's able to remove evil, he's powerful enough to remove evil, he would remove evil. So the fact that there still is evil in the world seems to be a problem. In fact, it seems at first to be a contradiction. What Plantinga does is show that actually there's no contradiction there. And he shows that by using these tools of modal logic, rigorous thinking that I've been mentioning. First of all, he distinguishes between a theodicy and a defense.